You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes over and bulldozed their villages, seized their property and their laws? They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 474, the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, of course, got some updates on the coronavirus, but I really want to highlight a lot of things that are going on that aren't receiving very much media attention as we deal with the coronavirus. The negotiations between the Afghan government and the Taliban are getting going. In Israel, it appears Netanyahu will be able to hang on as prime minister. And as the crippling U.S. sanctions continue against Iran as they battle with the coronavirus pandemic, we have Trump and other members of the administration giving concerning warnings to Iran. All right, everybody, I need you to share the show. You find it online over at the Libertarian Institute. I am the news editor at the Libertarian Institute. I write the daily news roundup, and both the roundup and the show could be found on the homepage, libertarianinstitute.org. Make sure you subscribe to the show somewhere, and where you subscribe to it, like, shares, ratings, reviews. All that stuff does help the show. If you really like to help out the show, you could donate to it over at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. All right, so the first thing I have up on today's show is a little bit more of a ceremonial note, but today is the day that North Macedonia has officially entered the NATO alliance. North Macedonia is the 30th country in the alliance and is just, another example of the problems with NATO expansion and how this has ramped up tensions towards Russia, and it's completely unnecessary. Adding North Macedonia to NATO doesn't provide any benefit to the United States. It puts the United States on the hook to, coming towards North Macedonia's aid. Of course, it'll probably benefit a company maybe like Lockheed Martin, who now North Macedonia is a market that gets preferential treatment for U.S. weapons and being able to access and get sales. And so that kind of thing will happen. But in no way does it benefit the American people to be entered, further into this alliance where we now have to guarantee the security of another Eastern European country. And the solution here is for the U.S. to pull out of NATO. Look, Donald Trump, from early on in his presidential campaign, had been talking about the problems with NATO. And at times, I agreed with his criticisms of NATO. And then, of course, it's Donald Trump. So he flip-flops from we got to get out of NATO to we need to repurpose and, retool and rebuild, which is all the wrong direction to go. And so while Donald Trump as a president has really a lot of his presidency's attention towards NATO, I think has been, at least as far as rhetoric goes, towards getting the European countries to pay more. And here now you enter another country that a minimal military. So, however it ends up working, the U.S. will be subsidizing their defense here. Even if they hit the 2%, it would be extremely insignificant compared to the $1 trillion the U.S. is going to spend on military. And so expanding NATO is absolutely not centered to the way Donald Trump, has his perverted interpretation of American first. So, I've talked about this in a lot of details on the show, especially the bad story here between North Macedonia and Greece. And Rand Paul took some heat on the Senate floor from John McCain for opposing, the U.S., allowing North Macedonia into NATO. Rand Paul made all the same arguments that I did. And I believe John McCain, who, before he passed away, implied that made Rand Paul an agent of Vladimir Putin. And that's why, I take the time on the show to talk about this, even though it's only ceremonial, is because, the rhetoric is that this is a great and fantastic thing. And we do need to be able to challenge, the NATO alliance and the reason for having America. It contributes so much to the new Cold War and our problems with, our relationship with Russia, because they keep looking for more and more states to put into NATO. And as they do this, it gets us closer and closer to getting to either Ukraine or Georgia being in NATO, which Russia has drawn a red line for. They share, I believe, over 1,000-mile border just with Ukraine, but between the two countries, well over 1,000 miles of border on Russia's southern border. Ukraine is very close to Russian population centers, and they say, hey, look, we've seen what you've done in Poland and other countries, you move all these military assets in, you put the Patriot missile batteries in, you withdraw from arms control agreements, and so it's too dangerous to allow that position to be for Ukraine, and so we absolutely can't have it, and that is, I think, the threat of this westward expansion of NATO is eventually it'll draw us into some kind of conflict with Russia. All right, so I was looking at worldwide statistics, and as I record this podcast, we had just crossed 100,000 cases, or 1 million cases, worldwide, and 50,000 deaths. And so, these are numbers that I now see out there in the media. And in one sense, I think that both numbers have some reason to, just don't take them at face value and say, oh my God. First of all, there's, people who aren't being tested. A lot of the tests have a, very high rate where they could give bad results. And so my guess is that the number's higher because so many people just show minimal symptoms. But, just seeing that as we cross this number, I'm not sure if it's anything that should, cause you to reevaluate the way you're treating this virus, which should be serious. But at the same time, I think there's going to be some additional scaremongering around these numbers. Additionally, the 50,000 number, there's a lot of people who have pointed out that there's a difference of people dying from coronavirus. So you're otherwise healthy, you get coronavirus and you pass away, versus somebody who, say, has, advanced form of cancer, an advanced lung problem, or is already in some way, like, probably doesn't have a long prognosis of life left, then getting coronavirus and dying. The two things do seem to be different numbers of being a cause of death, and I guess just one of the cause of death. Although on the other side of that, you also have the fact that people are skeptical of the numbers that came out of China as far as deaths, and so maybe China has had more of an outbreak. It seems that in the U.S., the numbers are continuing to rise, and with that, more restrictions are coming down. It's just important people stay vigilant to this, and I think the best thing we could do is continue to raise the need for debate about these kind of things. Not to tell people that, oh, you're stupid for wanting a lockdown, by saying, like, hey, let's really talk about this. And think about the fact that sometimes it's really hard to get the government to go back to how things were before a crisis. And we could talk about 9/11 and the Patriot Act and the spying that Snowden exposed and all these kind of things, and say, hey, if we go down this road, we have to be very vigilant. And so maybe, we don't want to go down those roads. And I think those are, conversations that us, as especially libertarians, but anybody, who's a big fan of civil liberty, should be having with people, because while there is reason to be concerned with the virus and to take precaution, that doesn't mean that we want the, hammer of the federal government clamping down, making dictates for all 330 million Americans who live in such a wide variety of, population or city versus a state like Montana as far as population density goes. If you want to look at the fact that, one state like Arizona, very hot, a lot of desert, versus Alaska, which is, just it's Arctic, versus the island chain of Hawaii, and making dictates for all 50 states probably really doesn't make sense. And, just to continue to be vigilant of what they're looking to do as far as spying and surveillance goes, police departments using drones, they're going to buy the drones, and they're going to have the drones. And if they're already flying and say, oh, they're this effective, they're going to be very unlikely to turn it off. I think there's something, again, vigilance and bringing up the debate and talking about it. And, because it doesn't seem like that's going to really happen at all within the government. All right, moving on to Afghanistan, where we have the Taliban and Afghan government engaging in talks. Again, this was a 3-person Taliban delegation that was scaled down because of the coronavirus, meeting with the Afghan delegation, which I believe is 21 members. It looks like an agreement has been made for the first 100 Taliban captives and 20 Afghan government captives released. This is certainly a step in the right direction and should be applauded. Now, the end result of this prisoner swap should be 5,000 Taliban prisoners being released and 1,000 Afghan government prisoners being released. And so we're a long way from this, goal and very important first hurdle we need to get towards moving to some kind of stable or more stable, or at least less awful situation between the Afghan government and the Taliban. I will say, if you look at it, 100 to 20, this is the same ratio as the agreement that was signed between the U.S. and the Taliban. So it does look like that is somewhat being held to it, and we're moving forward with it. So a possible good sign there. Of course, the story of Afghanistan, especially since 2001, has just been one tragedy after another. And we have one this week where a roadside bomb in Afghanistan, the southern Helmand province, both the Taliban and the Islamic State Khorasan group are active in that area. That roadside bomb kills 8 people in one family. And so, one miserable situation, and horrific, not only for all those lost, many of them, apparently most of them being children, but also for the few remains, family members who survived with injuries, and who will have to this horrific event to live and remember the rest of their life. It will be very difficult. And so it's important to know that when we're talking about the reason that we have to leave Afghanistan is so that the country could eventually find its way out of the situation where every week this isn't happening, or maybe it's not this, maybe it's a U.S. drone strike, maybe it's a Taliban or Islamic State suicide attack, maybe it's an Afghan government airstrike that hits the wrong target, or one of the CIA-backed militias made out of Afghanis that goes around and commits war crimes. All these things are happening over and over in Afghanistan, and the U.S. presence there is only contributing to it and only prolonging the amount of time that this is going to be. All right, in Israel, I believe I mentioned this already, but it looks like Netanyahu has worked out a coalition with his main opposition, Benny Gantz, where Netanyahu will remain prime minister for 18 months and then is supposed to be handing over the reins to Benny Gantz. What I want to talk about is a couple articles written by Jonathan Cook that I think had important analysis on and kind of revealing about the state of things in Israel, where Benny Gantz is the head of this coalition of varying degrees of kind of politically. This isn't a situation where his coalition is made out of all people from the same side of the political spectrum either, and has some very right-wing elements, but everybody in his coalition, which is called Blue and White, is essentially anti-Netanyahu, and that's what brings them together. And so after the most recent round of election, Netanyahu has enough votes with his Likud party and coalition to nearly be able, but fell just short of having a majority, so he couldn't form a government. Benny Gantz had far fewer people in his coalition. However, the third place coalition was called the Joint List, and these are the Arab parties made up of the people that the Palestinians typically vote for. And it turns out that there were enough Palestinians and members of the Blue and White coalition that could join together and actually get a majority government. Now, I believe in the history of Israel, Palestinians have actually never been a part of that government. However, there have been times where they were not a part of the government, but still voted for it anyways, essentially allowing it to happen. The way it should work is that if you're a part of the government and, having 15 seats is fairly significant, that if this was, let's say, Israeli party of some kind, one of the Jewish parties, likely they would get a ministership or two. So maybe the education minister and the justice minister or something like that. But in the case with the Palestinians, no Israeli, or Jewish political party will join with them ever to, allow them into their government. And so again, there's been one time where they kind of do this, what I think call outside vote thing, where they're not a part of the government, but they still vote for it. And that was going to happen. But it turns out even that really wasn't a politically tenable situation for Benny Gantz, and decided rather to join a coalition with Netanyahu, which was opposed by his own party, many members. The party about splits in half, with some portions of the former Blue and White coalition falling now in line. They'll get a couple of the ministerships. And again, the way the agreement is worked is that Benny Gantz would then give or take over as prime minister in 18 months. However, many people are throwing a lot of skepticism and saying that Netanyahu has a reputation for double dealing. And there's a lot of reasons to speculate that if you're Benny Gantz, you're going to have to really be on your toes at the very least to try to get your turn as prime minister in 18 months. Also in Israel, we just have a state where they're turning to their government and allowing Netanyahu to come down with executive unilateral authority, saying all Israelis must wear masks now in public. Surveillance systems that had typically only been used on Palestinians are now also being used on the Jewish citizens of Israel. And this is something that's really bothering a lot of people. This is a trend that we're seeing everywhere really in the world, where the executives of countries are getting a lot more power to put in place draconian measures that otherwise would have been outright rejected by everybody. All right, so the natural gas transfers from Iran to Turkey have been halted in what Iran says was a PKK attack on the pipeline inside of Turkey, but near the border with Iran. This probably is a bad situation for Iran, because at this point, any kind of income they could get for anything is important. And so these pipelines being attacked, it could cause even more disruption to a country and an economy that's really suffering. The U.S. did issue sanction waivers again. I believe these are for 90 days or 120 days to companies to continue to work on changes to Iran's Arak nuclear reactor that was laid out under the JCPOA. So these are, I think at times even Western, maybe a Canadian company and a Russian company are working to retool this reactor to make it produce a kind of nuclear fuel that is harder to turn into material that could potentially be used to make a nuclear bomb. Important to note that Iran has actually never tried to do that. Germany used the US-made Instec system to sell medical equipment to Iran for the first time. This was put in place by the EU to try to save the nuclear deal with Iran after the US unilaterally withdrew from it and put sanctions back on Iran in 2018. Unfortunately, this never really took effect because the US threatened to sanction it, and for a long time wasn't used. The system was finally used for the very first time, so it's a good thing to see it was used. I guess the way this company used the system was they're very careful not to run afoul of any possible US sanctions, and maybe the US let one go through. That way they could say, see, look, the people who are saying sanctions are preventing medical aid from getting to Iran are lying. But it's very clear that that's what's happening. There's been multiple reports, and just about every organization that doesn't directly accept money from a government that is interested in overthrowing the regime in Iran will tell you that the U.S. sanctions are so strict and that they require just so much information that everybody's so afraid of running afoul and getting secondary sanctions that forget if it's medical or not, they're just not willing to do the transactions anymore with Iran. It's also worth knowing that there's this group that has members on, that were very close to the Trump administration, and their goal is to go out and bully companies into not doing business with Iran, say, you're doing business with the terrible regime, you got to stop it. And they've been successful in doing that. Now, my real concern I have right now with Iran is a statement coming out from Donald Trump himself, I believe on Twitter, although we've heard similar things now from several members of the Trump administration. And the claim is that Iran is planning some kind of secret attack against American forces in Iraq, and that Iran would either be doing this with their own forces or through Iraqi forces. And so I think, the problem I see here is this is kind of like setting a red line in Syria about using chemical weapons. Obama does that, and then suddenly there's chemical weapons attached. Oh, look, it turns out that one of them are a false flag and the others are propaganda campaigns to create the opportunity for the U.S. to bomb Assad a couple of times under the Obama administration, nearly bomb Assad. So I think that's the kind of thing you worry about happening here, is a group like ISIS who wants to see, not only the American empire fall, but also, the Ayatollah in Iran see a perfect opportunity to provoke an overreaction from the Americans by carrying out an attack on our forces. That's why it's incredibly important that if there is an attack on U.S. forces or, a Iraqi base that holds U.S. forces, then we have to ask for evidence. It's not good enough to say it's classified or something like that. If you're talking about an operation that's either going to, if it's a significant operation against the Shia militias, even if the Trump administration claims they're backed by Iran, which, isn't like a proxy force type situation, they have common goals. In Iraq, a large part of that was defeating ISIS. And so, that's why the Americans and the Iranian government were both willing to help the Shia militias in Iraq. Now, some of them are very close with the Iranian Quds Force and IRGC and do have disdain for the U.S. as well. And so there's that common interest there. Maybe a group like Kataib Hezbollah doesn't necessarily make them a proxy force, but And it's important to remember that a lot of Iraqis see groups like this as part of the, security forces. And in fact, a lot of them actually are in name members of the Iraqi security forces. And so, carrying out that attack is almost like an attack on the Iraqi military, I would say. And from, again, the perspective of a lot of Iraqis would be an attack on the Iraqi military. So that seems like a significant step beyond just, whatever operations we're supposed to be doing in Iraq with the trained soldiers there. That they have to go to Congress. They have to present evidence about that. Or we say, no way, Mr. President, you can't carry out an attack here. I think the other possibility is this attack happens and then it escalates in some kind of tit for tat. It could happen eventually, the U.S. actually attacking the Iranian homeland. Again, extremely dangerous, especially in the middle of this, coronavirus pandemic. All right, the last couple stories I have here are out of Africa. In Somalia, we continue to have the underreporting of civilian casualties caused by the United States, with 2 civilians being killed in February. Separate strikes. The U.S. said they killed Al-Shabaab. Of course, that's not the case. Good article write-up on it at The Guardian. Quotes from air wars and places like that. Link to that in the show notes page. The EU apparently is going to try to deploy warships off the Libyan coast to enforce the UN blockade of the country. Of course, this is kind of a joke because the EU has been very interested, different member states like Italy and France, in supporting opposite sides of this war. And so many of the places the weapons are coming in from would either be like across the Egyptian land border or being flown into the country. So I'm not sure this warship is going to be a particularly effective way of enforcing the blockade. It may be a show force, but awfully foolish to be deploying ships at a time like this, especially because if a corona outbreak happens, it's so hard to quarantine, and then it's going to break out and spread like we see on the USS Theodore Roosevelt. All right. That'll do for the show for the week. Hope everybody's enjoying it. Go to the Libertarian Institute to share the show and the news roundup. Check out my Twitter at KYAAALE, private Facebook group, Foreign Policy Focus, Twitter or patreon.com/Foreign Policy Focus, and give it a rating and review wherever you like the show. Hit the like button if you're still listening. Really appreciate it, and I'll be back next week with a fresh 3 shows.